Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the Western esoteric tradition. With me is Richard Smoley, who is editor of Quest, the journal of the Theosophical Society in America. He is also the past editor of Gnosis magazine. In addition, he is the author of many books, including Hidden Wisdom, a guide to the Western inner traditions, and Inner Christianity, a guide to the esoteric tradition. The Dice Game of Shiva, how consciousness creates the universe. How God became God, what scholars are really saying about God and the Bible. And also Forbidden Faith, the secret history of Gnosticism. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you as well. When we think about the Western esoteric tradition, in a way, it's kind of hard to know where does it all begin. My best guess is it actually starts with ancient shamanism.
Yeah, except the thing about ancient shamanism is there are no written records of it.
Yeah.
So a great deal of what we think of as ancient shamanism is a somewhat imaginative projection onto artifacts, which themselves are silent because people didn't write in those days. Nonetheless, there seem to be some connections between what looks like people were doing back in those days and what's called shamanism now. And of course, shamanism is a word it's gotten a fairly defined meaning at this point, but it basically has to do with otherworldly journeys and using the knowledge therein to help people, ranging from solving food problems for a tribe to healing diseases to any number of other things. So yeah, that probably is where the Western esoteric traditions began.
Although I suppose generally speaking, many scholars would go back to ancient Egypt and Imhotep, the designer of the early pyramids, and I mean, we had a high culture in ancient Egypt as long ago as 4,000 years ago with very elaborate esoteric traditions.
Yes, that's true. And of course, the Egyptian civilization was certainly one of the earliest. It seems to have sprung up almost spontaneously or immediately around 3000 BC for reasons that are never quite clear. And it lasted in a recognizable form really until about AD 500. And we're certainly familiar with a lot of the artifacts, the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the hieroglyphs. And this was obviously a highly developed religious framework. I am never completely sure that what we say Egyptian religion was about has much to do with what it was really about to the people involved. I do always get a sense with Egypt that we are at a remove and our mentality is different enough from theirs that it would be a good idea to be careful about making too many suppositions.
Well, one interesting thing I know from my visits to Egypt, if you visit the Step Pyramid, designed supposedly by Imhotep, who some people credit as being the founder of Western esotericism, well, right adjacent to that pyramid is a fascinating structure. I think it was the school of Imhotep, and its design is very distinctly non-Egyptian. It's more Sumerian in design. So there was clearly a lot of cultural exchange between ancient Egypt and Sumeria.
Yeah, well, scholars tend to like to isolate things, and they like to assume that there was no travel or communication between these different civilizations in ancient times. Obviously, that's not the case. because there was, for example, a certain metals trade with Britain, where things like tin and copper were mined, and there was some kind of commerce between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and very likely the Indus Valley civilization in today's Pakistan. Scholars avoid focusing on this because it means that they would have to know a great deal more and have to pay a lot more attention to things outside their ostensible field. So it's much less confusing to just pretend that it's a discrete little box of goods. Now, what's interesting about Egypt is the Greeks credited much of their knowledge to the Egyptians.
Yes.
And we know the Greeks went to Egypt. It's not a long trip by boat, even in those days. There was an enormous amount of exchange. And when the Greeks say that they got a good number of their ideas and their knowledge from Egypt, it's probably not a bad idea to take them at their word.
Well, another important source has to also be the Persians, and Zoroaster or Zarathustra, who I recently did an interview with an expert in that area, Jason Georgiani, who's saying current scholarship is now dating Zarathustra at 6500 BC.
Wow. That's way back there.
It is.
Well, Zoroastrianism, basically is one of the shaping forces of Western civilization, although we don't think about it very much, and it's not very prominent in people's minds or imagination. But we do owe two very basic concepts to the Zoroastrians. One is a strongly dualistic view of the world as good versus evil, light versus dark.
The struggle between these two forces played out on the battlefield of the human mind.
Precisely. Their gods were, the good god was Ahura Mazda, the bad god was Ahriman, so on. And although later religions like Judaism and Christianity were not kind of supposed to be dualistic, particularly Christianity, they became very, very dualistic in this way. Scholars will sometimes say Christianity is a semi-dualistic religion. Without getting into the technicalities of that, there's certainly some accuracy to it. Now, another thing that the Zoroastrians brought to us was basically this concept of the end times, a kind of final conflagration in which the world we know it, the structure of the world we know it, just kind of collapses in on itself. And this was something that was imported into Judaism. In pre-exilic Judaism, that is the Judaism before the 6th century BC, this is not really very prominent. But after that, and this was the time of the exposure of the Jews to the Persians, it becomes much, much more prominent. Oh, by the way, the devil, Satan, does appear in the Hebrew Bible, but not in anything that was written before the exile in the 6th century BC. So in the older texts, Yahweh is the source of both good and evil, and there are verses in the Bible that actually say as much.
Yes.
Yahweh tempted David to make a census of the people, which turned out to be a bad thing to do because then he punished David by causing a plague. So the ancient Judaism before the exile was profoundly monotheistic in that everything came from this one source. After the exile, it became more dualistic, and there was this quasi-autonomous being called the devil, who sometimes is part of the heavenly cohort. He sort of shows up in heaven and has a chat with God in the beginning of the book of Job, and then later on becomes a force that is just about almost as strong as God, and as in the typical Star Wars movie, the dark side is always just about to win until the last minute when it turns out it doesn't.
Well, of course, we could go on for a long time with the scholarly exploration of these many threads, but fundamentally, when we're talking about the esoteric tradition, in Western culture, we need to contrast it with exoteric. And could you define the differences?
Well, exoteric religion is outer. That is to say, it is the forms, the rites, the dogmas, the beliefs, the institutions of religion in our civilization. All civilizations have this exoteric form. And in addition to that, although this is not well known, there is an esoteric form in which these things, all of the things I've just mentioned, do not necessarily have so much of a literal truth, but they are speaking about actual things that are going on in the psyche of man individually and collectively. Now, the word esoteric comes from Greek roots meaning further in. And although you can parse that a couple of ways, one way is to say you have to go further into yourself to understand what these things are saying. The exoteric view, say, of the Gospels would have, well, Jesus is arguing with these Pharisees and scribes and whatnot. Well, this is all sort of interesting up to a point. But from an esoteric point of view, you have to look at it as like, well, each of us has a scribe and a Pharisee and a hypocrite inside ourselves. And in an esoteric inner sense, these verses are talking to that. Of course, this is a bit more, shall we say, sophisticated. And people, as a rule, don't like introspection. I would say, it would seem that there are more extroverts than introverts in the world. So this is naturally not going to seem as obvious and not as important to many people. And therefore it seems irrelevant and can also seem threatening.
Well, one of the concepts that I find almost universally associated with esoteric cultures, particularly Western, but not exclusively Western, is the notion of initiation.
Yes. And closely related to that is, shall we say, an idea of transformation. And the idea is, in some way or another, the human being, as he or she is born, is not complete or completely formed. And even social conditioning, that is to say, you learn which fork to eat with, you learn not to burp at meals, you learn to be nice to the policeman and all that sort of thing. All of that is completely essential. But even that does not, shall we say, is not the final completion of the human being. There is some kind of inner transformation. Again, obviously, both in my books and in these concepts, inner keeps, as a almost relentlessly keeps coming up, and this is no accident. There has to be a certain kind of inner, let's say, something has to gel. And bring it all together. Initiation had this purpose. The most commonly known forms were in the old Greek mysteries, where people would go to these places and they would observe certain rites, they would hear certain things, they would be put in a certain frame of mind. The details are very, very mysterious because they were sworn to secrecy and they basically kept their word. But
which is an amazing thing in and of itself.
Definitely. But they came out of it transformed. And one kind of glimpse into this transformation, that is the result of this initiation, is something that Cicero says in one of his texts, that these mysteries improve us and give us greater hope for the life thereafter. So one idea and one experience that these things were imparting was that there is something in you that is immortal, and it's there whether you like it or not, but you might as well make contact with it because you're not really a complete being unless you do. And the mysteries and the initiation of all sorts, I would say, broadly speaking, have that as kind of a common goal.
Well, and I have heard other descriptions of testimonials from initiates who say things like, "I no longer fear death."
That's exactly it. That's what Cicero said.
Of course, since the Renaissance in Western culture, we've had many relatively modern revivals of these ancient esoteric traditions, all sorts of organizations from the Rosicrucians to the Sufis, the Theosophists, of which you're currently involved. In many ways, what we think of as New Age culture is a rebirth of these ancient traditions. I suppose, though, from a scholarly point of view, we can't ignore Hermeticism.
No, all of these things go together.
Yes.
To give a really brief sketch of it, and there are many brief sketches of it possible, but here's a fairly standard one. A lot of these ideas flourished in classical antiquity, in the philosophical schools, which were almost like schools of initiation. And these notably were the Platonic and Pythagorean schools. And these ideas continued. Well, what ideas? Like, for example, reincarnation. They had a bit of a problem after the 4th and 5th centuries AD, because Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And Christianity itself is a kind of mystery religion, which we can go into later. But it was a mystery religion that once it took over, started to persecute all the others. The old pagan schools were closed. The Greek philosophers had to go to a country that was more tolerant, which happened to be the world of the Muslim caliphate. In those days, they were the tolerant, enlightened ones, and the Christians were the insane fanatics, if that's any interest to anyone. But it did survive in both the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and in the West. Now, the Renaissance, which started, I'd say around 1450, all of these ideas had been there, and they sort of came out again. Because the Catholic Church was becoming a little shaky in its almost total control. I mean, totalitarianism, as we know it, was invented by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. In the old days, the Roman Empire didn't really care what you believed. That if you were going to revolt against Rome, and you better, just offer a pinch of incense to Caesar. Just
the emperors were worshipped as gods, but they weren't the only gods.
They weren't the only gods, and the enlightened people in ancient times didn't even really care and didn't believe in it themselves.
There were many materialists in ancient Rome.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't really care. All they wanted to do was, just to have this kind of allegiance.
Yeah.
But in medieval Christianity, you had to believe this stuff. If you believed even something that was almost practically 100% identically the same, except for one little glitch here and there, you could well be hauled off to the stake.
Yeah.
And this raises a question that we can go into at some point or another, but this is a fact of human nature.
Many of the leading esoteric scholars of the Renaissance era were persecuted.
In one way or another.
Burnt at the stake, Giordano Bruno, for example.
Yeah, and but there was this period in the Renaissance when these ideas were a little bit more permeating the world of the intellect.
Yes.
And, for example, a piece I wrote for Quest magazine recently was about Shakespeare's worldview. Now, Shakespeare's worldview only makes sense in terms of the occult philosophy of the Renaissance.
And particularly his final play, The Tempest.
Yeah. I mean, there's like a Magus, Prospero, who's very much part of that. That is the worldview of Shakespeare's plays. That was actually what was current in his time. That was actually the zenith of its influence when he was coming of age. So, that makes perfect sense. But no sooner had the kind of totalitarian control of the Catholic Church waned than a new wave of intolerance came with basically a scientistic materialism.
Yes.
Now, these traditions are not persecuted per se in Europe and the United States. They're certainly regarded as intellectually extraordinarily disreputable. And if you were writing, and I'm talking, think of some mainstream intellectual periodical. I'm not going to name any because I don't feel I owe any of them anything. Just think of one, and it's on the list. They really cannot write about these subjects without contempt and often an almost willful ignorance, to the point of getting even major details wrong. So these things are, although they've been rediscovered and there's an enormous amount of popularity, the intellectual world is still rigidly against it. Some people are telling me that this is weakening. I'm willing to take their word for it, but I don't know. I'm not sure I've seen it yet.
In other words, esoteric culture in contemporary times is very much on the fringes of our society.
In a way it is, and in a way it isn't. And there's a discrepancy between the intelligentsia, the American intelligentsia, who have to, most of them have to at least profess this kind of rather shallow, cynical materialism. And then there's what the people believe. And these ideas permeate the popular mind. Like, to take one example.
It's one of the reasons, I suppose, that there's hostility to it, is because they are so popular. And in the popular mind, there are various exaggerations and delusions and reasons why a thoughtful intellectual person might want to keep it at arm's length.
Yes, but this keeping it at an arm's length is often just kind of a safety mechanism. It's like, well, if I accept at least some of this, hypothetically, my whole little worldview comes crashing down. Never mind that this is actually a rather unstable worldview, and the people who hold this worldview seem rather insecure and neurotic as a group. But I guess those people have been even more alarmed by it. But to take one example, what am I talking about in terms of popular belief versus this intelligentsia? Well, reincarnation.
Okay.
Reincarnation.
Good example.
Now, reincarnation was taught by Plato and Pythagoras. The end of Plato's Republic has a reincarnation myth in it, which Plato probably meant more literally than a lot of people would like to believe. So it's always been around. And in the last century, in the West, in the United States, it has become a matter of popular belief. What do I mean by that? I mean that the polls of the last 2 decades generally reliably have the percentage of the U.S. population who believe in reincarnation to be somewhere around a quarter of the population.
Yes.
Which is, considering most Americans are supposed to be Christians and Christianity has never taught reincarnation, this is really... It's
about the same percentage as people who say they are born-again Christians.
Yeah. And, oh, by the way, there's no, these two are not mutually exclusive. Maybe you're not supposed to believe in reincarnation if you're a born-again Christian, but there are plenty who do. There are plenty more who do and feel they have to keep their mouths shut about it. So, that is, of course, the world of religion as it always is. It's always, like all forms of human endeavor, it's always a little messy and complicated, and the contradictions exist not only in society but within individuals.
Well, today, though, if you have an interest in esoteric subjects, there's like a smorgasbord. There must be, I would say off the top of my head, 100 different organizations that are offering seminars, courses, workshops, books, opportunities to become lifetime members, and so on, that are teaching one or another version of what is essentially an offshoot of the Western esoteric or Hermetic tradition.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Now, for various historical reasons, a lot of Eastern ideas have permeated into this. But these Eastern ideas are not as foreign as we might think. Like most people would say that reincarnation and to a certain extent, the coming of Asian religion to America was one thing that popularized reincarnation.
And certainly the Theosophical Society had a big role to play there.
It certainly did. The Theosophical Society, which was founded in 1875, has been enormously influential, even though its membership has always been tiny.
Yeah.
And still is tiny.
Yeah.
That itself is a long subject. But this Eastern idea of reincarnation brought to us supposedly fresh by the Hindus and Buddhists. Well, yeah, it does go back to Plato, and Plato is one of the cornerstones of Western civilization.
But as we pointed out, that there was commerce between the ancient Indus Valley civilization, the birthplace of Hinduism and yoga, and Egypt, going back thousands and thousands of years. So the distinction between East and West, it's always been rather porous.
Very.
Yeah.
And with that question, there are basically two stances people take. I don't think they're exclusive, but they're often treated. One is called diffusionism. That is the idea that all of this started at some unknown center, at some unknown point in prehistory, and it's all spread out. That is one view.
Yeah.
The other view is a more archetypal view, is that, well, if this is the case with human inner experience, that is to say, if these things have anything at all meaningful or accurate to say about the inner life of humanity, they would have been discovered independently in all sorts of different places. And, well, they look like each other for the same reason that, we all have basically the same anatomy and, the same
In other words, there's a fundamental truth that's being expressed. Well, Richard Smoley, our time has run out, but this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for being with me.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.